Recently I went to New York to try some of the best pizza in the city, and while every slice I had there was pretty incredible, there were a few in particular that really blew me away. They had this unique, pillowy, almost marshmallow-like bite to them, which combined with the crispy bottom and the fresh, tangy, garlicky sauce was honestly kind of addicting. To the point that I've been craving that pizza ever since I went on that trip. I've been trying to recreate it at home, but after tons of attempts, I always encounter the same issues. My dough is either too dense, too light and bready, and sometimes even dry. But after interviewing some of the best pizzeria owners in New York, I finally know what's been missing. So far I've basically been using my regular New York style pizza recipe for my grandma style pizza as well. Because during my trip to New York, I found that that's what a lot of places do. However, I think some of the best slices I tried actually used a completely separate dough. So let me explain what I'm thinking. Basically, when you combine flour and water, what you're doing is creating gluten. Gluten is a protein that gives bread its strength and chew and allows it to trap gases so that it can end up light and airy. However, the high gluten flour that's typically used in New York style pizza actually creates the dough that's too chewy for grandma style pizza in my opinion. So we need to make some changes. And I think what's gonna help me to make a softer, more tender dough that won't dry out is oil. The problem though is that I need to add it in a very specific way or else it's gonna have the completely wrong effect. Because you remember how I mentioned that gluten is essential for a great bread or pizza dough? Well, when you're making a basic dough with just flour, water, salt, and yeast, that gluten can develop no problem. But once you start to throw a fat like butter or olive oil into the mix, it can start to mess with that gluten development. I mean, just imagine like if you have a plant and you put a plastic bag over it before watering it, the water wouldn't be able to reach the plant and therefore it would stunt the growth of the plant. Basically the same thing is happening when you add oil to dough. The oil coats the strands of gluten, preventing the water from hydrating the flour properly and therefore preventing the gluten from fully developing. So the result is a dough that lacks elasticity and also the strength necessary to trap enough gases and make a great dough. Fortunately though, I have a solution to this. So this is a book called Advanced Bread and Pastry. It's basically like the definitive resource on everything bread and pastry. So while it's not cheap, I think it is worth the investment. Anyways, the reason I'm talking about it is because it contains the secret to incorporating fat in your dough so that you don't ruin it in the process. Basically, it says that if you're adding anything less than 4% fat, it won't negatively affect gluten development, and so you can just add it along with the rest of the ingredients at the beginning of the process. However, higher amounts of fat, up to about 15%, should be mixed in when the dough is halfway developed, and if you're adding more than 15% fat, it should be added when the gluten is nearly fully developed. And these are Baker's percentages, so that basically means 4% fat would be 4 grams of fat per 100 grams of flour. 2% would be 2 grams per 100 and so on. The only thing is that this is for solid fats like butter. When we're making pizza dough, we typically include liquid fats like olive oil. And as I was reading through this book, I realized something really interesting. You see, most pizza makers drizzle their oil slowly into their dough at the end of mixing. And that's what I've always done too, but according to this, there might be a better way. In another section, it says liquid fat should be added to the dough at the beginning of the mixing process. Or in other words, right along with the flour and water. If a particularly large quantity of oil is required though, it can be added at the end of the mixing process after the gluten is mostly developed. So this means that drizzling oil into your dough at the end isn't necessary unless you're using really large amounts, like up to 15%, but that's usually never the case with pizza. So for me, this is gonna completely change the way I make my dough going forward, at least in theory, but I still have to test it for myself and see if it actually gives me the results that I'm looking for. But after all this thinking, I need a little boost of energy. Because personally, I often struggle to maintain a consistent level of energy all throughout the day. I find that as I get fatigued, particularly in the early afternoon, it becomes harder and harder to stay focused on what I actually need to be doing. And my morning coffee helps, but as I'm sure you can relate, sometimes drinking more coffee just makes me kind of anxious and jittery. Which is exactly why this video's sponsor, Magic Mind, set out to create a product that gets you to 100% mental performance consistently without any of those negative effects. Magic Mind is a mental performance shot that gets you more focused, mentally clear, motivated, and productive while reducing stress. So personally, I've been drinking Magic Mind every day for the past week, while working in my apartment, at coffee shops, running errands, even while making pizza, and I've already noticed a more steady supply of energy and mental clarity throughout the day. My favorite part though is that Magic Mind is not a coffee replacement. It's meant to be consumed alongside your morning routine, almost like a daily vitamin, but for your mind. In fact, it contains ingredients ingredients like L-theanine that help your morning coffee last all day, and it contains herbs that help reduce stress and provide a sense of calmness and a lifted mood. And Magic Mind is so confident in their product that they offer a 100% money-back guarantee, no questions asked, for 100 days after purchasing. So visit the link in my description below and use the code CharlieAnderson20 to get 48% off your first subscription purchase, or 20% off your one-time purchase. So thanks again to Magic Mind for sponsoring this video, and thank you for your support. Now, let's make this pizza. So for this experiment, I made 5 pizzas, and the only difference here is the oil content. And by the way, I'm constantly doing experiments like this, most of which I don't have time to show on this channel. So if you want to find out about all my learnings, you can join my email newsletter via the link in the description below. Every week I send out simple, actionable pizza making tips to help you level up your skills. And of course, it's free to join. So anyways, one of these pizzas has no oil, 3 of them have varying amounts of olive oil, and then I also have one wild card that I threw in there, which we'll talk about in a minute. So for all of these, I used high gluten flour, and I used a hydration of 65%, meaning 65 grams of water per 100 grams of flour. And to make sure the dough is mixed thoroughly, exactly the same way each time, I use a stand mixer. This also makes sure the oil is mixed in properly, which will prevent it from hindering the gluten development. However, as always, this can be done by hand if you don't have a stand mixer. Alright, so first I've got my no oil pizza as sort of a control. So definitely a solid pizza, but still a little bready and chewy with that high gluten flour. So now this next one is 3% olive oil, which is kind of the typically recommended amount for pizza dough. So already that fixes a lot of the issues I had with the no oil dough. It's a lot more tender, even a little more moist on the inside. So I'd say it's definitely an improvement, but let's keep trying here. So this one I actually used 10% olive oil, which is quite a lot, but it's probably the most I could reasonably see myself using in a pizza dough. That one's very interesting. Like I said, I don't know that I've ever used that much oil in a pizza dough, but it does have a pretty nice effect. Let's keep trying these though before I come up with my final decision. So this last one here, I'm really interested to try. But before we get there, let's try this wild card here that I mentioned earlier, which also uses 3% oil, but instead of olive oil, I use a neutral oil. Main reason being, I just wanted to see if you can actually detect the flavor of oil in the dough or if it's more just for texture. This is not exactly what I expected. I thought it'd be a pretty subtle difference, but as soon as I bit into this, the flavor is noticeably more sort of bland and neutral, whereas the olive oil dough, it's got a more aromatic, olive oily flavor, I guess you would say. So even though olive oil is more expensive, I do think it's probably worth using. But now last but not least, let's try this round one over here. And what I did here was use 50% oil, which is probably the most oil you could pretty much put in a pizza dough. So for this one, I incorporated 10% of the oil at the beginning of the process, as the book recommends, and then mixed the dough to nearly full gluten development. Then I slowly added another 40% of oil, for a grand total of 50%. I mean, I could tell toward the end my dough was sort of breaking and the gluten structure was becoming a lot weaker. And just lifting this pizza up before I cut it, it was pretty much tearing itself apart. So it feels like it's gonna be super tender, and I'm just really curious to see what it tastes like. Yeah, so just super, super tender as you might expect. And the olive oil flavor is pretty strong as well. It kind of tastes like, I mean, it didn't rise nearly as much as the others, so it's almost sort of like a flatbread that you just dipped in olive oil. It actually turned out a little dry somehow. Not really sure on the science behind that, but definitely wouldn't recommend going this high with your oil content. By the way, another interesting thing I'm noticing, more oil doesn't actually lead to more browning. It almost seems to be the other way around for some reason. I think that's a common misconception about oil. I mean, that's what I used to think myself, but it seems to just have more of an effect on the tenderness and moisture level of the dough. So with all this decided, I'm basically between my 3% olive oil and 10% olive oil dough. The question is, which one gets me closer to the result that I'm looking for? It's a really tough decision. I mean, these are both great, and honestly, they both get me a lot closer to what I'm looking for. The 10% has a really nice tenderness that's pretty unique, but the 3%, possibly with a slightly different fermentation process, might also be what I'm looking for. So honestly, I think I might end up somewhere between these two. However, I think I know how I'm gonna figure that out. You see, the other day, something really weird happened to me. I was hosting a pop-up, and a friend of mine brought me a slice of Sicilian pizza from a local place here in Cleveland, and as soon as I bit into it, it was like an epiphany. It was nearly that same same texture, that marshmallowy pillowiness that I've been looking for. So I reached out to the pizzeria owner, and sure enough, he said he'd be happy to have me in there and show me exactly how they make it. And I'm gonna take you along with me, so you can click here to check out that video once it's uploaded. In the meantime, you can click here to watch me try some of the best grandma style pizza in New York, so you can see exactly what it is I'm trying so hard to achieve. Anyways, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.